When people hear that I cut my only son out of a $12 million inheritance, they usually assume I acted out of anger. They imagine a stubborn old man throwing a tantrum because his feelings got hurt. If only it were that simple. The truth is, I didn't make that decision in a single night. I made it over 30 years in broken promise at a time, but the final piece fell into place on my 80th birthday. And it all started with a phone call. My name is Harold Whitmore. I'm 80 years old, a widower, and the founder of a construction company. I spent 40 years building from the ground up. People often ask how I managed to become successful. The answer is easy. I showed up. I showed up when work was hard. I showed up when money was tight. I showed up when my wife, Eleanor, was sick, and after she passed away 9 years ago. I kept showing up because I still had one reason to keep going. My son Daniel, he was my only child, the boy I taught to ride a bicycle. The teenager who spent Saturdays handing me nails at construction sites. The young man who once told everyone he wanted to be just like his father. Life, of course, had other plans. Daniel became a successful corporate executive. He lived nearly 1,000 miles away with his wife Emily and their 16-year-old daughter Sophie. I was proud of him, always had been. But somewhere between promotions, business trips, soccer tournaments, and luxury vacations, family slowly became something he planned around instead of planned for. Still, I never complained. Parents aren't supposed to keep score. At least that's what I told myself. 3 months before my birthday, my doctor leaned back in his chair after reviewing my latest test results. Harold, he said gently, you're doing well for your age, but I think it's time you stopped assuming there will always be another year. He wasn't trying to frighten me. He was trying to prepare me. As I drove home that afternoon, his words stayed with me. There will always be another year. What if there wasn't? That evening, I opened an old photo album. There was Eleanor laughing while frosting a birthday cake. Daniel at 10 years old wearing a paper party hat that was too small for his head. Tiny Sophie asleep in my lap during my 70th birthday dinner. Those weren't expensive memories. They were ordinary, and somehow they had become priceless. That's when I decided I wanted one more family birthday. Nothing fancy, no catered meals, no ballroom, just dinner and my home stories around the table. Eleanor's old chocolate cake recipe and everyone together. For an old man, that didn't seem like asking for much. I called Daniel the next morning. Dad, happy early birthday. He laughed. You've still got 3 months. I know, that's why I'm calling now. I explained my plan. There was a brief silence before he answered. Well, be there. You promise. Of course I wouldn't miss your 80th birthday. I smiled all afternoon. It sounds foolish now, but hearing those words made me feel 10 years younger. I even marked the calendar with a red circle. Daniel coming home. The next few weeks became the happiest I'd had in years. I polished the dining room table myself. I found Eleanor's handwritten recipe box. I invited old neighbors, former coworkers, church friends, and a few cousins. Everyone said the same thing. 80 is a milestone, Harold. It'll be wonderful having the whole family together. Every time someone mentioned Daniel, I smiled proudly. My boy wouldn't miss this for the world. I believed every word. 3 weeks before the party, my phone rang just after dinner. Daniel, his voice sounded different. Too careful, Dad. Do you have a minute? Always. So something's come up. Whenever someone begins with those words, good news never follows. Emily had found an incredible ski vacation package. The resort was famous, the kids were excited, the flights were already available. The discount was unbelievable. The package couldn't be changed, couldn't be refunded, couldn't be postponed. We've been talking about taking this trip for years. Daniel said it just happens to fall on your birthday weekend. I waited. Surely he was about to say they weren't going. Instead, he sighed. I was hoping maybe we could celebrate the weekend after. The room became strangely quiet. I looked across the living room at Eleanor's photograph resting on the fireplace. She seemed to be looking back at me. Waiting for my answer, I swallowed the lump in my throat. I understand, Dad, you're not upset. Are we'd come if we could. I know. After a few more awkward sentences, we hung up. I remained sitting in my chair long after the phone screen went dark. The silence felt louder than any argument ever could. The following days were filled with cheerful phone calls from guests confirming they would attend. No one knew Daniel wasn't coming. I couldn't bring myself to tell them. Each morning I looked at the empty guest room anyway. I even washed the sheets. Old habits die hard. Hope dies harder. The morning of my birthday arrived bright and cool. Neighbors decorated my porch with balloons. Margaret Ellis, my oldest friend, arrived early to help in the kitchen. She looked around the house. Everything ready? I think so. She noticed the extra place setting already arranged at the dining table. You still expecting Daniel? He said they couldn't make it. Margaret rested a hand on my shoulder. She didn't say another word. She didn't have to. By 6 o'clock, the house was full. Laughter echoed through every room. Former employees hugged me. Children ran through the hallway. Old friends told stories I'd nearly forgotten. For a little while, I almost forgot the empty chair at the end of the table. Almost. Then someone asked the question. So, Harold, when does Daniel get here? Every conversation stopped. I forced a smile. He couldn't make the trip. A few people nodded politely. Others exchanged uncomfortable glances before changing the subject. The empty chair remained untouched all evening. No one sat in it. No one moved it. It was as if everyone silently understood it belonged to someone who had chosen not to be there. Later, everyone gathered around as Margaret carried out Eleanor's famous chocolate cake. 80 candles would have been impossible, so she placed one large candle in the center instead. They began singing. I smiled, I even laughed. But when I looked across the table, I couldn't stop my eyes from drifting toward that empty chair. When the song ended, I made one wish before blowing out the candle. Not for more money, not for more years. Just one more chance to have my family together. After the guests left, I washed the last plate and turned off the kitchen light. The house felt enormous, too quiet, too still. I poured myself a cup of tea and sat alone. At 9:47 p.m., my phone buzzed a message from Daniel. I smiled for the first time all evening, thinking perhaps he was calling to apologize. Instead, it was a photo: Daniel, Emily, Sophie, all three of them grinning from a ski lift with snow-covered mountains stretching behind them. The caption read, "Fresh powder. Best vacation ever." I stared at the picture, then I noticed the timestamp. It had been taken at exactly 718 p.m. The same moment my friends had been singing "Happy Birthday." I locked my phone without replying. Outside, the night grew darker. Inside, something in my heart quietly broke. I didn't cry. Not because it didn't hurt, because some disappointments are simply too deep for tears. That night, I couldn't sleep, and just before dawn, I walked into my study, unlocked the old safe beneath my desk, and slowly pulled out the envelope containing my will. I placed it on the desk, rested my hand on it, and whispered into the silence. If my time meant so little to him, I took a long, steady breath. Perhaps my money should too. The sun had barely begun to rise when I pulled into the parking lot of my attorney's office. Most people don't schedule appointments at 7 o'clock in the morning. Then again, most people don't spend an entire night staring at a ceiling wondering when exactly they stopped. Mattering to their own child, I sat in my car for a moment, gripping the steering wheel. Part of me felt foolish after all. Daniel hadn't committed a crime. He hadn't stolen from me, he hadn't insulted me, had simply chosen something else: a ski trip, a vacation, a weekend of fun. The problem was that it wasn't the first time. Not even close. My attorney Richard Mason had handled my legal affairs for nearly 20 years. When I walked into his office, he immediately frowned. "Harold, you look like you haven't slept." "I haven't." He gestured toward a chair. "What happened?" I placed my current will on his desk. "I need to make changes." His eyebrows rose. "Significant changes." Very. Richard opened the folder and began reviewing the documents. For several seconds, the room remained silent. Then he looked up. "This concerns Daniel." "Yes." He leaned back. "Before we do anything, I need to ask whether you're acting emotionally." I laughed quietly. At 80 years old, Richard, everything is emotional. He smiled slightly. "Fair enough." Then his expression grew serious. "You currently leave roughly $2 million directly to your son. I know if you change that today, it will permanently affect your relationship." I stared out the window. The relationship has already been affected. Richard didn't argue. Instead, he asked a question. "What happened yesterday that was different from all the other disappointments?" The answer surprised even me. "Nothing," he frowned. "What do you mean?" I folded my hands. "Yesterday wasn't different, it was familiar," and suddenly memories began surfacing. Not one, dozens, years of them, small moments. Tiny disappointments, the kind that don't make headlines. The kind that slowly accumulate until one day you realize they're all you have left. The first memory came from nearly 30 years earlier. Daniel was 21 ID, spent weeks restoring an old fishing boat. Nothing expensive, just a father and son weekend. The night before the trip, Daniel called a friend had invited him to a beach party. Could we reschedule? I remember laughing and telling him to enjoy himself. Young men should have adventures. I truly believed there would be plenty of fishing trips later. There never were. Then came the year Eleanor underwent surgery. It wasn't life-threatening, but she was terrified. Daniel promised he'd be there. The morning of the procedure, he called from an airport. An important business conference had come up. His boss needed him. He sounded genuinely apologetic. So we forgave him again. A few years later, Eleanor celebrated her 70th birthday. She spent days preparing. She cooked Daniel's favorite dishes, wrapped gifts for Sophie, decorated the dining room herself. An hour before dinner, Daniel canceled. Sophie had a soccer tournament. They couldn't make the drive. Eleanor smiled when she hung up. Then she quietly removed 3 place settings from the table. I remember finding her in the kitchen afterward, washing dishes that hadn't even been used, trying not to cry. Richard listened carefully as I recounted memory after memory. He didn't interrupt, didn't judge. He simply let me talk. Perhaps because he understood something important. The birthday wasn't about one missed party. It was about a lifetime of postponed priorities. The most painful memory arrived unexpectedly. Eleanor's final week's cancer had taken far more than her strength. It had stolen her time. One afternoon, she sat beside me on our porch swing. The autumn leaves drifted across the yard. She held my hand and asked quietly, "Do you think Daniel will visit soon?" I smiled. "He'll be here. He keeps saying next weekend. He means well." She nodded. But I could see the sadness in her eyes. She wasn't angry, just disappointed. The kind of disappointment that comes from loving someone deeply. Daniel did eventually visit 3 days after her funeral. He arrived exhausted and heartbroken. He cried, he apologized. He blamed work, traffic, scheduling, conflicts. Life, I believed him, because I wanted to, because parents are experts at forgiving their children. Even when they shouldn't be. Richard finally broke the silence. Harold, have you ever told Daniel how much these things hurt? I thought about that. The answer embarrassed me. No, why not? Because every conversation ended the same way, how he apologized. And then nothing changed. Richard nodded slowly. He understood. There comes a point when explaining your pain begins to feel pointless. Not because the other person doesn't care, but because caring never turns into action. He closed the file. What exactly do you want to do? For a long moment I didn't answer. I wasn't interested in revenge. Despite what some people might think, I still loved my son. Nothing could change that. The problem was that love and trust aren't the same thing. One can survive long after the other disappears. I want my money to mean something. Richard looked at me carefully. What does that mean? I took a deep breath. The scholarship fund we discussed last year. He nodded. The one for students entering trade schools. Yes, and the children's hospital. Another nod, and a trust for Sophie. His expression softened. You've always adored that girl. She's the only one who still calls just to talk. Richard began making notes. The room filled with the sound of his pen moving across paper. Then he asked the question I'd been avoiding, and Daniel, I stared at the family photo sitting inside my wallet. The one taken years ago. Back when Sophie was little, back when Eleanor was alive, back when I still believed there would always be another opportunity. $1. Richard stopped writing $1. Yes. Why not simply reduce the amount? I shook my head. Because this isn't about money. Then why the dollar? I looked directly at him. So hell no, it wasn't an oversight. For the first time all morning, Richard had no response. Several weeks passed. Life settled into a routine. The birthday decorations disappeared. The cake was gone. The house grew quiet again. Daniel never mentioned the photograph had sent from the ski resort. Suspect he assumed everything was fine after all. I hadn't complained. I hadn't argued. I hadn't raised my voice. From his perspective, nothing had changed. In reality, everything had. Then one Saturday afternoon, my doorbell rang unexpectedly. When I opened it, I nearly dropped the book I was holding. Sophie, my granddaughter, smiled nervously. Hi, Grandpa. I pulled her into a hug. What are you doing here? She glanced toward the street. My friend lives nearby. Something about her expression told me there was more to the story. I invited her inside. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where an empty chair had haunted me just weeks earlier. For a while we talked about school friends, college plans, ordinary things. Then Sophie became quiet, very quiet. She stared into her cup of hot chocolate, turning it slowly between her hands. Finally she looked up. Grandpa. Yes, I'm sorry I missed your birthday. My heart softened instantly. You don't have anything to apologize for. I do know, sweetheart. Her eyes began to fill with tears. I wanted to come. I blinked. What I begged. Mom and Dad. The room suddenly felt smaller. Sophie lowered her voice. I told them your 80th birthday was important. I didn't say anything. I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the rest, but she continued anyway. I even cried. My chest tightened. What happened? Sophie swallowed hard. Then she spoke the sentence that changed everything. Grandpa. She looked down at the table. Dad never told you the real reason we went on that ski trip. For several seconds, neither of us said a word. The only sound in my kitchen was the slow ticking of the old clock Eleanor had insisted we keep even after it began losing a few minutes each month. I looked at Sophie. She looked so much like her grandmother when she was nervous. Tell me, I said softly. She took a deep breath. A week before your birthday, Dad wanted to cancel the ski trip. I blinked. He did. She nodded. I heard Mom and Dad arguing after dinner. Dad said your 80th birthday only happens once, and that we should stay home. My hands tightened around my coffee mug. Then why didn't he? Sophie hesitated. Mom said we'd lose almost $15,000 if we canceled $15,000. She nodded again. The vacation wasn't refundable. I leaned back in my chair. For the first time since my birthday, I felt something other than hurt, confusion. So your father wanted to come. He did. Then what changed? Sophie looked down. He said Dad will understand. He always does. Those 7 words landed harder than anything else Shed told me. Not because they were cruel, because they were true. Daniel believed I would understand because I always had. For decades I had made disappointment easy for him. Every canceled visit, every missed holiday, every forgotten promise I had smiled, forgiven, and waited for next time. Without realizing it, I had taught him there would always be another chance. Sophie reached across the table and took my hand. I'm really sorry, Grandpa. I squeezed her fingers gently. This isn't your burden to carry. But Dad feels bad, does he? She nodded. He talks about you all the time. I couldn't hide my surprise. He does. He says he wishes work wasn't so busy. I smiled sadly. Wishing and choosing aren't always the same thing. She frowned, trying to understand. When people tell you you're important, I said quietly, listen to what they do, not just what they say. She nodded slowly. I hoped she would remember that lesson someday. Before Sophie left, she hugged me tightly. "I'll come see you more often. You don't have to promise I want to, unlike many promises." I'd heard over the years hers felt genuine. As I watched her walk down the driveway, I realized something: the future of my family wasn't standing on the ski slopes. It had just walked out my front door carrying a backpack. The seasons changed. Summer faded into autumn. Leaves covered the yard Eleanor had loved so much. I spent more afternoons sitting on the porch, wrapped in an old blanket, watching children ride their bicycles down the street. Life had become quieter. Not lonely, just quieter. Daniel called every couple of weeks. The conversations were always pleasant. He asked about the weather, the garden, my doctor's appointments. Then his phone would beep with another meeting reminder. "I've got to run, Dad." Of course, "We'll visit soon. I'll look forward to it." We both knew how that sentence usually ended one afternoon. Margaret stopped by with homemade soup. She studied me carefully as I answered the door. "You've lost weight." "I've lost my appetite." That's not the same thing. She wasn't fooled. Margaret had known me for over 50 years. She could tell when something was wrong before I admitted it to myself. "Have you been back to the doctor?" I nodded. "And?" I forced a smile. "He says 80-year-old engines don't run forever." She didn't smile back. "What did he really say?" I looked toward the window. My heart isn't getting stronger. Margaret quietly sat beside me. "Does Daniel know?" No, why not? I took a long breath. "Because I don't want him visiting out of guilt." Had come, would he? She didn't answer. A month later, I collapsed while trimming the rose bush Eleanor had planted years earlier. I remember reaching for the garden shears. Then everything went black when I opened my eyes. Bright hospital lights stared back at me. A nurse smiled. "Welcome back, Mr. Whitmore." Apparently my neighbor had found me lying in the yard and called an ambulance. The doctor said I'd been lucky. Very lucky. At my age, luck doesn't arrive often. Margaret called Daniel before I could stop her. He caught the first available flight. When he walked into my hospital room the next morning, he looked nothing like the confident executive I remembered. His tie was crooked. His eyes were red. He hadn't shaved. Dad. He crossed the room and hugged me so tightly I could barely breathe. "I'm so sorry." "For what?" "For everything." I looked at him carefully. Had Sophie told him Shed visited? Had he finally begun adding up the years the way I had? "I should been here." His voice cracked. "I didn't even know you were this sick." I smiled faintly. "You were busy." The words weren't meant to punish him. That made them hurt even more. Daniel sat beside my bed for hours. No phone, no laptop, no rushing to another meeting. Just father and son. It felt strangely familiar, like something we'd done decades earlier. "I've been thinking," he said quietly. "I do that a lot these days." He gave a weak laugh. "I keep telling myself, it'll make more time." I looked at him. When he opened his mouth, then closed it again, neither of us needed to say the answer. Tomorrow, next month, after the next promotion, after the next vacation, after life slowed down. The future had always been his favorite place to keep his promises. Before he left that evening, I reached into the drawer beside my hospital bed. Inside was a sealed envelope. His name was written neatly across the front. I handed it to him. "What's this?" "A letter." He looked confused. "Should I read it now?" I shook my head. "Not yet. When you'll know." He slipped the envelope into his jacket pocket. "I love you." "Dad, I know. I mean it. I know. And I did. That was never the problem. Love had always been there." Time hadn't. 3 months later, I returned home. My strength wasn't what it used to be. Simple tasks became difficult. Climbing the stairs left me exhausted. Margaret visited often. So did Sophie whenever she could. Daniel called more frequently now. Sometimes twice a week. He even talked about planning a visit for Christmas. I appreciated the effort. I truly did. But some bridges, once damaged, can never be restored to exactly what they were. You can cross them again. You simply never forget the cracks. On a quiet winter evening, I sat in my favorite chair beside the fireplace. Eleanor's photograph rested on the mantel. I smiled at it. "I've done my best," I whispered. Outside, snow began falling softly. Inside, I closed my eyes peacefully without fear, knowing the people I loved would one day understand the choices I'd made. A week later, my family gathered in the same lawyer's office where I had sat months earlier. Daniel held the sealed envelope I'd given him. Richard Mason entered carrying a thick file. He looked around the silent room before speaking. "Thank you all for coming." He placed the folder on the table. "There has been one significant change to Mr. Harold Whitmore's estate." The room fell completely silent. No one knew that the greatest inheritance Harold had left behind wasn't measured in dollars. It was measured in regret, and the reading of the will was about to prove it. No one spoke as Richard Mason opened the thick folder resting on the conference table. Daniel sat across from him, still wearing the black suit he'd worn at my funeral. Beside him, Emily stared at the polished wood floor. Sophie quietly held her father's hand. The room carried the kind of silence that only follows the loss of someone who can never be replaced. Richard adjusted his glasses. "Before I begin," he said, "Mr. Whitmore asked me to remind everyone that this document reflects months of careful thought. It was not written in anger or haste. Daniel frowned months. Richard nodded. He made these decisions shortly after his 80th birthday. Daniel lowered his eyes. He already knew what birthday Richard began reading, "My residence shall be sold with the proceeds distributed according to the terms of this will." He continued through several pages. A portion of my estate would establish the Eleanor Whitmore Trade Scholarship, helping students who wanted to learn skilled trades but couldn't afford tuition. Another portion would fund the Children's Hospital where ID received treatment. Several longtime employees who had remained loyal for decades each received generous gifts. Margaret received the small lakeside cabin where she and I had spent countless weekends fishing with Eleanor. She quietly wiped away tears finally. Richard paused. The remaining educational trust established for my granddaughter Sophie Whitmore shall remain protected until she completes college or reaches the age of 25. Sophie's eyes filled with tears. I don't know what to say. Richard smiled gently. Your grandfather believed education was something no one could ever take from you. Then came the final page. Richard looked directly at Daniel. My son Daniel Whitmore. Daniel straightened in his chair. Shall receive $1. No one moved. No one even breathed. Emily looked at Richard in disbelief. There must be some mistake. There is no mistake. Richard answered calmly. Daniel remained perfectly still. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. Instead, he slowly closed his eyes. Deep down, I think had already known. Richard reached into the folder and removed a sealed envelope. Mr. Whitmore instructed me to give you this immediately after the will was read. Daniel recognized the handwriting. It was the same envelope ID handed him in the hospital. He had never opened it. His fingers trembled as he carefully unfolded the letter. The room remained silent while he began to read. Dear Daniel, if you're reading this, I'm no longer here to tell you these words myself. That saddens me more than you will ever know. I want you to understand something before you read another sentence. This letter is not written by an angry father. It is written by a father who loved his son until his very last breath. Nothing that even disappointmental to change that. When you were born, I promised myself I would always give you every opportunity I could. I worked long days, so your future would be easier than mine. Watching you succeed became one of the greatest joys of my life. I never wanted your money. I never needed expensive gifts. I never expected perfection. I only wanted your time. That was the one gift you kept. Promising yet somehow never found. Over the years I watched birthdays become meetings. Fishing trips become conferences. Family dinners become business flights. Your mother's final weeks became next weekend. Then my 80th birthday became a ski vacation. None of those moments by themselves broke my heart. But together, they told me where I stood in your list of priorities. You often said you loved me. I always believed. I simply wish your calendar had believed it too. People think inheritances are rewards. I disagree. They are reflections of our deepest values. I chose to leave my estate where I believed it could create the greatest good. To students chasing dreams, to children needing hope, to your daughter whose kindness reminds me so much of your mother. As for you, I leave $1, not because I wanted to humiliate you, but because I wanted you to know this decision was intentional. You may think I took $2 million away from you. The truth is I spent 40 years trying to give you something far more valuable. Time, unfortunately, you didn't realize its worth until there wasn't any left. If this letter causes you pain, I'm truly sorry. But if it changes the way you live the rest of your life, then perhaps it will become the greatest gift I ever gave you. I forgive you. I hope someday you'll forgive yourself. Love always, Dad. By the time Daniel reached the final line, tears were falling freely onto the paper. He didn't wipe them away. He simply stared at the signature, as though hoping another page might appear. Another conversation, another chance. There wasn't one. Emily quietly whispered, Daniel. He shook his head. No. She looked confused. We're not contesting the will. Richard looked surprised. You understand that's your legal right. Daniel folded the letter carefully. My father spent 30 years telling me exactly what mattered. I just kept refusing to hear it. Outside, the office reporters waited after hearing rumors about the wealthy businessman's estate. Daniel walked past every microphone without saying a word. There was nothing to defend. Nothing to explain. Some mistakes are too personal for public statements. Over the following months, Daniel made decisions that shocked everyone who knew him. He resigned from the executive position, had spent decades chasing. Friends called him crazy. Business partners offered larger salaries to convince him to stay. He declined every offer. For the first time in his adult life, he wasn't choosing money. He was choosing time. He began volunteering at the Eleanor Whitmore Trade Scholarship Foundation, not because it would earn him the inheritance. That opportunity was gone forever. He did it because every student he helped reminded him of the man had failed to appreciate while he was alive. His relationship with Sophie changed too. Every Friday evening became theirs. Sometimes they cooked dinner together. Sometimes they went hiking. Sometimes they simply sat on the porch talking for hours. Whenever work interrupted, Daniel canceled the meeting. Instead, not because life had suddenly become less busy. Because Head finally learned that being busy and being present were two very different things. 1 year later, on what would have been my 81st birthday, Daniel drove alone to the cemetery. In his hands was a homemade chocolate cake, not perfect. The frosting leaned slightly to one side. The edges were uneven, Eleanor would have laughed. He placed the cake beside my headstone and sat quietly in the grass. There was no phone in his pocket, no laptop beside him, no meetings waiting, just silence. Just memories. Just time, exactly what I'd wished for on my final birthday. The wind moved gently through the trees as Daniel looked at my name carved into the stone. "I'm here." Dad, he whispered, and finally here. He remained there until sunset, not because anyone expected him to, but because at last he understood that love isn't measured by what we leave behind. It's measured by the moments we choose not to miss, and some lessons cost far more than $2 million to learn.